You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
It's good to be back with you, as always, Prashant. This week, we're going to do a little bit of a different tack on the Asia Geopolitics podcast. I know we usually respond directly to the news cycle, but I wanted to sort of take a step back and do a podcast on a functional topic area, this time on trade in the Asia-Pacific region. That's been hot with news not too long ago, especially that India had formally decided that it will now be sitting out its participation in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But I also thought this would be a good opportunity to take stock of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, the successor agreement to the Trans-Pacific Partnership after the United States departure. That agreement is now in force with 7 out of the 11 signatories observing tariff reductions there. And also, of course, we'll talk a little bit about the perennial dynamics in the U.S.-China trade war. So I think we'll go in that order, Prashant. So to kick us off, India's decision on RCEP. I mean, I personally didn't find it to be too surprising that New Delhi decided to sit out its participation in this major multilateral trade deal. It brings together 16 countries. It's often described in the media as China-led, but it's very much an ASEAN-centered process. RCEP, by definition, is ASEAN plus ASEAN's FTA partners trying to bring together all of these countries into a broader multilateral framework. India was slated to be the third largest economy in RCEP after China and Japan, but New Delhi has decided to sit out the agreement. So from where you're sitting, Prashant, what do you make of this decision in terms of India's Act East policy, its broader relationship economically with countries to its eastern periphery, certainly in Southeast Asia, but also around the region? How do you view this in terms of New Delhi's geopolitical position?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you noted, it's not surprising that we saw this, but nonetheless, it doesn't look good optics wise for New Delhi's regional engagement, right? So, I mean, the idea that India would be the stumbling block for trade negotiations is something that ASEAN countries are quite familiar with, and Asian countries more generally. So even when the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement was negotiated, for example, it took a long time for negotiations to actually be concluded, and there were negotiators that had actually been, scarred by those negotiations and talks. So the fact that we saw this wasn't that surprising, and there was also a lot of discussion. I think even as early as last year about this idea of RCEP -1, so that the rest of the countries would go forward, and depending on whether these countries would be able to address India's grievances or not, India might still be part of the RCEP, or it might not be part of RCEP. So that part wasn't surprising. I mean, the part where it sort of doesn't look good for India is, as you pointed out, I mean, India has noted that it wants to sort of play a broader role in the Asia Pacific, and particularly in Southeast Asia, with this idea of the Act East policy. So we've seen a lot of developments on the security side and geopolitically. But the fact that this economic side continues to be troubled, RCEP is, after all, as you said, it's an ASEAN-centric agreement. It was originally meant to be a harmonization of various agreements that ASEAN signed with various countries, including India. So the fact that India is the holdout here, doesn't reflect well on India, but it also doesn't say a lot for Southeast Asia looking to engage all these various countries. It just reinforces the fact that India is a lot harder to engage on in terms of economic issues, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's important to maybe delve a little bit into why India decided to sit out the RCEP negotiations. So I know that trade deals are a little bit of an arcane area. So for podcast listeners, just briefly to go a little bit deeper into RCEP, RCEP primarily focuses on the reduction of tariff barriers, and India has been running a deficit with 11 of the RCEP negotiating countries, and that's been a major point for New Delhi, especially the deficit with China, which was a major focus of the recent bilateral Modi and Xi Jinping meeting, the informal summit that took place between the two sides in South India. With that said, I think part of what's being left out of the RCEP debate, and at least some of the international commentary, I thought India should have signed on to RCEP, but I at least understand where the Modi government is coming from here. I suspect the domestic politics angle here is actually doing quite a lot of work. So this summer, India released shortly after the election, after Modi and the BJP won a unparalleled large mandate, and the largest in 30 years. The Indian Ministry of Statistics released GDP estimates, which showed pretty dismal figures. GDP growth of just 5%, the lowest growth since the first quarter of 2012, 2013. This, basically the point is that India's economy is running into headwinds right now. And there's a lot of sort of bitter pills of reform that Modi, while he came into power in 2014 on some optimism that he would be a prime minister to implement some of the reforms that other Indian prime ministers had not, primarily due to domestic political reasons, he still hasn't done that. And the way that the refusal to join RCEP is being presented to the Indian public, I think, is quite interesting by the BJP. Modi is sort of justifying his decision as saying that he's protecting India's poor. There's concerns that if India were to join RCEP and reduce tariff barriers, that it would get flooded. Indian markets would get flooded with cheap Chinese goods from other parts of Asia. But then, critics, including domestic Indian critics, are pointing out that this, in a way, is also an acknowledgement that the Indian economy is simply not ready to compete in Asia. And that's been sort of a long-term concern from those who want to see India better integrate itself into trade and supply chains in Asia more broadly. New Delhi has not had a good record on this. There's also the fact that India in general, structurally right now, has less to gain from RCEP, I think, in its perception. India would have the highest number of tariffs to reduce in terms of the major markets that are participating in RCEP. And it's also a highly, highly attractive market for the other negotiating countries. So countries like Japan and South Korea and many ASEAN countries view India as sort of a bonanza for their exports. So finding that balance, I guess, didn't work out. And then on the more technical side, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there were a lot of sort of issues in the RCEP negotiations on certain obligations, on so-called auto trigger mechanisms, protective mechanisms for India to take in place, certain measures to slow down the flow of imports after RCEP would come into effect. The other negotiating partners didn't want to incorporate that, so India couldn't have the backstops that it needed. So I think the broader story that I'm seeing here with India is that Modi right now is unwilling to tear off the Band-Aid on structural reform and absorb some short-term political costs and economic pain. And, implementing RCEP would not be easy for India, but over the long term, I do think that the benefits would begin to accrue and India would find itself better incorporated. Because, again, zooming out to the geopolitical level, we now see in India that's largely left out of the two emerging trade architectures in Asia, one being CPTPP. India has a lot of barriers to get to that. It would first have to join APEC to participate in CPTPP, and now with RCEP. So India, finds itself sort of an island. It has the attractive market for many of these countries that do want to trade with it, but it's simply not ready yet for the multilateral picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to reinforce that, I think the debate that you're sort of talking about, which plays out in a lot of these bigger countries. And the United States is the other example, right? So we now have two big countries, the United States, withdrawing from the TPP and the CPTPP moving forward. And now, if developments continue, India withdrawing now from this agreement, the RCEP, and that agreement going through. It just reinforces the big debate domestically in these countries about short-term costs for certain domestic industries, whether it's textile, agriculture, some of the ones that you mentioned, and the long-term picture, right? Which is that for India's economic competitiveness, being part of the supply chains and regional trade integration more generally is something that's a no-brainer for most of these folks who are looking at the data. But the debate between short-term costs and long-term benefits, is always something that's very contentious for these big countries. I think the other thing that bears noting is how the optics of this played out. So you did have India withdraw from part of the RCEP negotiations, but essentially now the optics of that is such that if this is something that's concluded by 2020, so the joint leader statement that came out mentioned that, that there were text-based negotiations that were now effectively complete. And if India is removed from these negotiations, could we finally see RCEP negotiated and commenced in terms of signing by 2020, right? Because as we mentioned in the previous podcast, I think we've had this sort of annual cycle where we say, okay, RCEP is going to be negotiated by the end of this year. So whether 2020 will finally break that cycle. I mean, the reason why that's significant is now you have Vietnam that's going to be the chairman of ASEAN next year. And Vietnam is a country which has, is now party to all the various sort of permutations of trade agreements. It's part of CPTPP, it's part of RCEP, and it's also negotiated the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. So it does give, on the positive side, if you look at it, Hanoi the opportunity to secure an economic win next year by saying, hey, this RCEP negotiations were finalized under Vietnam's chairmanship. And I think the Vietnamese in particular are very keen on having that economic win because I think they noticed that without that, there's going to be a lot of focus on security issues. One of which is the South China Sea issue, which we've talked about, repeatedly on this podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Vietnam has really been pulling a lot of weight. I mean, disproportionately on encouraging free trade in Asia. Really, Vietnam and Japan, I would say, outside of China, have been playing a really important role here. I mean, when the Trump administration withdrew from the TPP, it was primarily the Vietnamese who saw that as I mean, all of the TPP countries saw it as a huge blow to the effort, but the Vietnamese in particular took it quite hard. So. Vietnam certainly, I think, positioned itself weird here. The other thing I'll say on optics is, we talked a little bit earlier about the optics of sort of India saying that it wants to act east, but then pulling out of RCEP. It's interesting that in the official Indian statement, India emphasized that it negotiated in good faith. India wants to emphasize that it's withdrawing from RCEP primarily because its interests could not be addressed, not because it's necessarily an obstructionist on trade. I mean, that is commonly the perception of India, that it's a very difficult country to work with on multilateral trade and bilateral trade issues. But I think India definitely wants it to be seen that it remains involved in the, it continues to at least have the intention of acting east. But yeah, I mean, the withdrawal from RCEP, I think is... if I had to guess, I would think that New Delhi will probably come to regret this decision. RCEP, if it does lead to greater integration, and India does decide that in the future it would be interested in joining because it's more competitive economically. I mean, I think certainly the Indian economy is destined to become more competitive. The question is, over what time frame does India become more competitive? Is it a matter of years or decades? But when that happens, India simply won't have as much of a rule-making role in RCEP. If RCEP is negotiated and concluded, India can be brought in the future. China and ASEAN have said that. But when that happens, New Delhi certainly won't be able to address some of the issues that it was unwilling to compromise on, including things like I said, data localization, ratchet obligations, auto trigger mechanisms. So that, I think, will be a little bit of a missed opportunity here. I mean, the other thing is, there has been some talk of a U.S.-India bilateral arrangement. That's certainly been difficult under the Trump administration because of India's running deficit with the United States, which has been reduced a little. But things like also the removal of preferential trade status under GSP haven't been positive for that. But, that I think a lot of that will depend on whether the Trump administration can actually sustain a second term or even make it to the end of this first term, because negotiating a bilateral arrangement won't be something that'll happen overnight, certainly with India. So that's something else to keep an eye on. But let's pivot a little bit and talk about CPTPP. We haven't really been talking about that because the negotiations have been concluded. The agreement has entered into force. Where do you what do you make of the state of the implementation of CPTPP right now and the potential addition of new partner countries, including countries like Indonesia, which have expressed interest in the arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the other big conversation because if you see RCEP as the agreement where the standards are not very high, but it is more inclusive, you have the CPTPP where the opposite dynamics are true, which is that the standards are much higher, but because of that, you have more of an exclusive grouping of countries. And the hope was that initially, under the initial iteration with TPP, the United States being part of it, that other countries like Indonesia, Thailand would be part of this agreement because it is, it includes the United States, which is a big market. Unfortunately, the U.S. Removal from the agreement under the Trump administration has taken the wind out of the sails for that part of it. But I still think there's a lot of interest in CPTPP just simply because it is an agreement which, relative to RCEP, does have a lot of far-reaching implications in terms of labor rights, intellectual property. The standards just, really are much more significant than what we're seeing under RCEP. And so, in addition to the countries that you mentioned, big countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, Thailand, I think one of the other, big points of that are part of the conversation is will we get other actors? Most notably, Taiwan has been floated as, part of this conversation about whether you could get Taiwan, which is an economy but not, officially recognized because of the One China policy as being, a country or a nation state in that respect, join this agreement. And of course, the bigger part of this conversation is whether the United States in another administration or in a second Trump administration might enter back into the CPTPP to actually, sort of bring the benefits that we talked about before. Obviously, this would be, given the Trump administration and President Trump's own personal inclinations, much less likely under a second Trump administration than another administration. But the fact that we have a U.S. election that's coming up next year, really does bring to fore the question about whether we'll ever see the United States rejoin this agreement. Because I think of the various agreements that we're talking about in the Indo-Pacific, the CPTPP, really is the sort of big agreement that we're talking about. And as you pointed out before, we really do have to, credit Japan for keeping some of these agreements alive. Whether it's RCEP, where Japan has played a role on several occasions, actually, in keeping the negotiations alive, or CPTPP, Tokyo has really played a big role in keeping these negotiations up when some of the bigger countries, whether it's the United States or India, have withdrawn or expressed reservations on the agreements.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately TPP remains very much a hot button political issue in U.S. domestic politics. None of the Democratic candidates, at least the front runners, are willing to stake their necks out on committing to rejoin the agreement. Even as there's increasing concern now about competition with China, TPP remains, or CPTPP remains, sort of beyond the pale in political discourse. So we'll have to see. But yeah, I think that's another thing to watch for. The only other thing I'll mention is, the United Kingdom, of course, has expressed interest in joining CPTPP in a post-Brexit world. But again, I certainly don't have the qualifications to talk about what's going on with Brexit at this point. I'm sure there's other podcasts out there that can do a much better job of that. But moving on, I guess, finally to the United States and China. So a bit of a unexpected development in November with the cancellation of the upcoming APEC summit, which was supposed to provide the set piece or the backdrop to the signing of an interim or so-called phase one trade agreement. Of course, at this point, if you've been following the trade war, you probably know better than to actually stake out any decision-making on the news cycle, because things tend to fall apart at the last minute. Right now, it looks like the phase one deal will involve both sides pulling back certain tariffs, including China pulling back retaliatory tariffs on U.S. moves. But the question is the United States even capable of pulling back on tariffs, or will that, inherently be framed as the United States backing down before China addresses the entirety of issues that are on the U.S.-China trade dispute agenda? So I think that's the big question. China's certainly pushing for as many tariffs as possible to be pulled back, and I think that would be seen as a pretty significant win for Chinese President Xi Jinping if he's able to do that. But a lot of this, I think, hinges also on the December 15th deadline, which is the next deadline for the next round of tariffs that are scheduled. So the U.S. would scrap those on about 156 billion worth in Chinese imports. But from there, I mean, I think, it's still quite uncertain what exactly this phase one agreement is going to look like. Right now, the markets, at least here in the United States and around the world, are, if you follow the money, it seems like people are mostly expecting this deal to find conclusion by the end of the year. And if it doesn't, then I think we might see the old trade war news cycle repeat itself, where a deal falls apart, markets tank, inevitably momentum begins to build towards another deal, and we do the circle all over again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is the sense that this phase one deal between the United States and China, whether it's the extent of the rollback of tariffs is debatable in terms of the specifics, but there does seem to be, as you pointed out, a need for both countries to find at least an interim form of compromise, even though the bigger differences remain to be resolved. So, I mean, the DC dynamics here, matter, right? So President Trump is in the middle of a sort of effort by Democrats to move forward with impeachment. So domestically, I think he's quite preoccupied with other issues. We've got the U.S. elections coming up next November and the run up to those elections, and then of course, the optics of having major tariffs that would impact consumers go into effect in December 15th during a holiday period, right? Effectively in the middle of the Thanksgiving period and right before Christmas. I don't think would look good for the Trump administration. So I think there is a sense from both sides that they need to compromise on some level. And I think on the part of China, I do think that the Chinese would want to find some sort of economic accommodation, even though I think they continue to remain a little bit skeptical about whether they would be able to address the fundamental issues that the Trump administration has with China, right? So as we've seen from speeches from Mike Pence and Secretary Mike Pompeo, there are fundamental issues that transcend the economic priorities and deals that we're talking about, whether it's security issues, human rights issues. And so I think, irrespective of whether we find a phase one deal or not, this idea of U.S.-China competition will be something that will stay with us for quite a while, at least within this administration.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, the U.S.-China disputes are much bigger than a trade war at this point. So I think that's probably a good note to close on, Prashant. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, great. Well, thanks a lot for joining me. I think it was good to do a sort of zoomed out overview of trade issues. If listeners like more podcasts in this format, we're happy to do that. Just send us a note going forward. So if you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can do that on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, any other number of podcast providers. And if you like the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. It really does help. And before we close, just a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering this region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.